Welcome to my channel, a place where every mystery hides a story, and every story hides a truth. In the midst of forgotten streets, footsteps echo through the silence, and the faint glow of a lamp guards secrets that refuse to die. Every clue matters. A torn letter, a fading footprint, even the sound of a clock ticking in the dark. Here, doubt becomes a puzzle, and puzzles lead us to the heart of the unknown. So prepare your mind, watch closely, and listen carefully, because the shadows are speaking, and the truth is waiting to be found. This is where every case begins. Welcome to my channel. Asterisk.
Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was in the chill of an unusually bitter March that I first became aware of the singular affair of the lantern that, by all accounts, refused to reflect. The wind swept mercilessly down Baker Street, rattling the panes of 2 to 1 be like some insistent ghost of winter refusing to surrender its claim. Holmes, ensconced in his armchair and half lost in a cloud of shag tobacco, had taken no notice of the weather, nor of my repeated complaints about the draught creeping under the door. He had been particularly languid that morning, thumbing absently through monographs on early Indian coinage without so much as a mutter. I was about to suggest a walk in Regent's Park to rouse him when the bell rang twice, and with a hesitation between. "That," said Holmes, without lifting his eyes, "is neither a client nor a tradesman. It is a man who once considered walking away." The door opened a moment later, and Mrs. Hudson announced in her usual measured tone, "Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, sir." Lestrade entered briskly, rubbing his gloved hands together and shaking the damp from his bowler hat. "Holmes, doctor," he nodded curtly. "I've a riddle for you, one that's taken the wind out of my men, and frankly, I doubt even your violin could make sense of it." Holmes gave a slight smile and leaned forward. "You have my curiosity. Sit, Lestrade. Begin at the point that baffles you most." The inspector took the seat opposite and launched into it without preamble. "Last night, shortly after 10, the groundskeeper of the Millstone estate, Mr. Henry Cleaver, was found dead in the eastern greenhouse, just outside the main manor, throat slit, clean and precise. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no stolen items. And this is where it becomes troublesome. The entire estate was locked from within. No broken panes, no muddy prints, nothing disturbed but the man himself." Holmes steepled his fingers, brows drawn together. "The eastern greenhouse, a solitary structure, I assume?" "Yes. It stands apart from the main building, across a stone path that cuts through the frost garden. But Holmes, there's more. Mr. Cleaver had been doing routine maintenance. The head gardener saw him alive at 9:45, carrying the estate's antique oil lantern toward the greenhouse." "Antique," Holmes repeated. "A brass-bodied piece from the Crimean era," said Lestrade. "Polished weekly, kept on a special hook near the servants' entrance. But here's the odd part. When we examined the scene, we found the lantern beside the body. It was lit, but it wasn't casting a reflection in the glass of the greenhouse, not even the faintest shimmer. The panes were perfectly intact, freshly cleaned, but the lantern ... it reflected nothing." Holmes said nothing at first, his eyes now alert and glittering. He tapped his forefinger against his lips, then looked at me. "Watson, you've often spoken of your war experiences. Can you recall any material, any glass or surface that fails to reflect light altogether?" "Not unless it's been blackened, scorched, or covered," I replied. "A mirror in a smoking tent, perhaps, but even then, some shimmer remains." "Exactly." Holmes turned back to Lestrade. "Was the body moved?" "Not an inch," said the inspector. "And before you asked, the estate has 3 gates, all locked, keys accounted for. No guests were present, just the family, Lord Millstone, his bedridden wife, and their son Victor, returned from studies in Florence, all sworn to have been indoors by 9:30. Holmes rose, crossing to the window and pulling back the curtain just enough to peer into the fog-streaked street. "A lantern that casts no reflection," he murmured. "A locked estate, a slit throat without a struggle. Tell me, was the greenhouse warm?" "Very. Maintained for orchids." The thermometer read 29 degrees Celsius, yet no fogging on the glass. Lestrade blinked. "Now that you mention it, bone dry." Holmes turned from the window, eyes bright with interest. "Fascinating. I accept the case." "I thought you might," said Lestrade with a tired smile. "The carriage waits below, I trust." "Watson, you have sufficiently recovered from your earlier concerns about the draft. There is nothing more invigorating than a good murder." He reached for his coat and hat. I sighed, setting aside my tea. "Adventure once again, Holmes." "Adventured, certainly," he replied, "but this time with a shadow that neither glass nor flame can seem to catch. That, my dear Watson, is irresistible." And with that, we followed Lestrade out into the rising fog toward Millstone Estate, toward a man murdered without trace, and toward a lantern whose silence in the glass would prove to be the key to a mystery unlike any we had yet encountered. Chapter 2. The Matter of Illusions and Brass. Carriage wheels struck rhythmically against the cobbled streets as we rode in silence toward the outer bounds of Kensington, where Millstone Estate nestled behind a grove of frostbitten poplars and hedgerows, now reduced to skeletal outlines by the chill. Lestrade sat across from us, arms folded tight, his brow still furrowed from the events of the previous night. Holmes, on the other hand, seemed entirely relaxed. He had his head leaned back against the seat cushion, fingertips pressed together at his chin, and his gaze fixed on some point beyond the fog-smeared window. "Holmes," I said at last, unable to contain myself, "you've scarcely asked for any particulars. Surely a murder in a locked estate and a lantern that refuses to cast a reflection warrants more direct questioning." He smiled faintly, eyes still distant. "My dear Watson, the fewer particulars I receive in the beginning, the less chance there is of being misled by opinions disguised as facts. Our friend Lestrade, for all his commendable energy, has a tendency to frame events as puzzles already partially solved. I prefer them untouched." Lestrade huffed. "You think I've colored it too strongly. Come now, Holmes, you've seen stranger things than a lantern that behaves oddly." "Indeed," said Holmes, finally turning to him, "but a lantern is, by nature, a giver of light. When it refuses to reflect in glass, either the glass has betrayed its nature, or the lantern is not what it pretends to be. Both are equally worthy of investigation." I scribbled the remark down in my notebook. Holmes' observations often bore fruit only in retrospect, and I had learned over the years that even his most passing comments carried weight. "You mentioned Lord Millstone," Holmes continued. "Give me his particulars." "Aged 63, former colonial administrator in the East Indies, widowed once, remarried 5 years ago to Lady Evelyn, who's been bedridden for nearly 3 months with what the family physician calls degenerative nerve fatigue. They have one son, Victor Millstone, studied at Balliol, now finishing botanical research in Florence, returned 3 days ago." "Has Victor been to the greenhouse since his return?" "Claims not. He was home the entire evening with his mother, preparing some herbal compresses convenient," Holmes murmured. "And the body, Henry Cleaver, long in the family's employ, over 30 years, a veteran, much like yourself," Dr. Lestrade said, glancing at me. "Served in the Afghan campaign, honest reputation, a touch of rheumatism, but steady hands and no known enemies." I felt a pang of kinship with the murdered man. That he had survived war only to be slain beside a greenhouse by an invisible hand struck a grim chord. Holmes leaned forward now, his tone sharpening. "Tell me, Lestrade, what precisely do you mean when you say the lantern did not reflect? Was this a poetic flourish, or an observable phenomenon?" "I saw it myself," Lestrade said. "The brass body was lit flame steady inside, glass dome clean, but when held up to the greenhouse panes, it produced no reflection, none at all, not even in the brass fittings or steel tools nearby, like the light fell into something that swallowed it whole." Holmes was quiet again, but I saw his fingers twitch once, a sure sign that his mind had latched onto some thread he would not yet name. The rest of our ride passed in silence. Holmes closed his eyes but was not asleep. He was, I knew, reviewing the elements like a composer tuning a strange, unfinished melody. When we arrived, Millstone Estate was cloaked in fog. The main house stood stoic behind its gravel path, with narrow windows like watching eyes. The greenhouse, as Lestrade had said, was a separate structure some 50 yards to the east, domed and glinting faintly in the grey light. We were received at the door by a thin man in a stiff collar. "Mr. Asher, the butler, Lord Millstone awaits you in the drawing-room," he said, with no more expression than a statue. "Master Victor is with her ladyship, but will join you shortly." Holmes raised a hand. "Before that, I would like to see the lantern, the exact one recovered at the scene. Has it been moved?" "No, sir," said Asher, "per your instructions." "Inspector, it was returned to the greenhouse after examination, unlit." "Good," said Holmes. "Doctor, Come." As we stepped out toward the greenhouse, Holmes stopped suddenly on the gravel path and knelt. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "Two sets of footprints, one from a boot, narrow at the toe, the other from a softer sole, like a gardening shoe. The boot turns back, the softer one does not. They must be cleavers," I said. "Going in but never out." "Indeed," Holmes replied. And then, after a pause, "Unless the wearer of those boots returned, carrying another's shoes." Before I could reply, we entered the greenhouse. It was warm and humid, a surprising contrast to the air outside. Shelves of orchids lined the walls, white, violet, and yellow, strange blooms like frozen screams suspended in stillness. In the far corner lay a dark stain on the tile, the place where Cleaver had fallen. Holmes moved immediately to the lantern, which rested atop a stool. He held it up to the glass, and I, standing behind him, saw it again for myself. No reflection. The flame shimmered steadily inside the glass dome, but the panes gave no sign of its light. It was as though the lantern had been swallowed whole by the air. "Extraordinary," I breathed. Holmes said nothing, but he produced his magnifying glass and examined both the lantern and the glass surrounding it. Then, with a sudden decision, he doused the lantern and held it against his cheek. Warm, but no scent of oil. "Curious, Watson. Smell it." I did. There was no trace of soot or oil, no charred scent. It felt like a lantern that had burned nothing. Holmes straightened. "This, Watson, is not merely a question of murder. It is a question of manipulation, of sight, of senses, of what we assume to be real. You believe the lantern is a trick." "I believe," said Holmes, with a glint in his eye, "that someone has gone to remarkable lengths to hide something in plain sight, and we must determine what or whom that is." With that, he turned and walked briskly out into the fog, toward the manor and the family who waited within, each with their own secrets buried like orchids behind glass. Chapter 3. The glass that light. We re-entered the main house, through the side conservatory door, which Asher had discreetly unlocked for us. The scent of old books, dried lavender, and something vaguely medicinal clung to the air. Holmes paused only long enough to wipe the condensation from his boots before handing his coat and gloves to the butler. "The drawing room," he murmured, "but not before a quick word with whoever maintains the lanterns." Asher looked taken aback. "That would be Timothy, sir, the scullery boy. He polishes the brass and oils the wicks every Wednesday." Then Timothy was brought to the west corridor in 10 minutes' time. Quietly, I have no desire to interrupt his duties, or the household's delusions. With that cryptic remark, Holmes moved down the hall, his steps making no sound on the thick Turkish rug beneath us. The drawing room was dimly lit by natural light filtering through heavy curtains. Lord Millstone sat stiffly in an armchair beside the fire, a carved cane resting across his lap. His face bore the pallor of old parchment, and his eyes were grey and oddly distant as, though forever observing some horizon that only he could see. "You must be Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said without rising, "and Dr. Watson, I presume. I thank you both for attending to this business. I trust Lestrade has informed you of the ghastly details." Holmes offered a slight bow. "Inspector Lestrade has done his duty admirably, but I prefer to begin with my own observations. May I ask, Lord Millstone, when you last spoke to Mr. Cleaver?" 2 days prior," the old man replied. "I instructed him to double-check the east greenhouse's heat settings. The orchids are temperamental this time of year, and last night—" "Did you see or hear him at all?" "I did not. My leg and old injury from Bengal keeps me confined after sundown. I take a sleeping draught at 8. My wife and son were still awake, I believe." Holmes nodded, then turned slightly. "And Lady Evelyn, might I speak with her?" Only briefly, came a new voice from the doorway. A tall, sharply featured young man had entered. Victor Millstone, son of the house. He wore an emerald cravat and dark wool coat, and though his features were handsome, there was a nervous energy beneath the surface, like a violin string wound too tight. "My mother is heavily sedated," he said, stepping forward and offering Holmes his hand, "but I can answer whatever you wish to know. I tended to her myself last evening. Chamomile compresses and valerian drops. Interesting combination," Holmes said lightly. "Do you study medicine?" "Botany," Victor replied. "I've just returned from Florence, where I was documenting the pollination cycles of the ghost orchid. Quite a beautiful, fragile thing. Like my mother." Holmes's gaze sharpened, and like deception, he murmured, "Which, too, is beautiful and fragile." Until examined closely, Victor stiffened. "What exactly do you mean?" But Holmes did not answer. Instead, he turned to Lestrade, who stood just inside the doorway. "Inspector, I shall examine the servants' entrance now. Watson, with me." We descended a narrow corridor to the back of the manor, where the lantern was usually stored. A hook of wrought iron protruded beside the doorframe. Holmes examined it closely, running a gloved finger along its edge. "Smooth," he said, "recently polished. And on it is Watson, this slight discoloration just beneath." I leaned in. "Yes, a faint smear, grease, possibly, or residue from another substance. We'll have it analyzed." He turned to Lestrade. "Was this lantern the only source of light in the greenhouse?" "Yes, no electricity. Cleaver would have used it to check the plants and gauges. And yet," Holmes mused, "he was found lying as though the light had gone out, face turned toward the glass, eyes wide, blade drawn cleanly across the throat, almost ceremonial." "You believe he knew the killer?" I asked. "Not necessarily," Holmes replied, but he was not surprised. "And that suggests ... familiarity, trust, or distraction." A faint knock interrupted us. It was the scullery boy Timothy No, older than 14, with a mop of straw-colored hair and a nervous shuffle. "You asked for me, sir." Holmes smiled gently, an expression that often masked the sharpness of his mind. "Indeed, Timothy, you care for the brass lanterns, I'm told." "Yes, sir. Every Wednesday, I clean the glass with vinegar and lemon peel, and I oil the wick shafts." "Did you clean the Crimean lantern last Wednesday?" "I did, sir. Mr. Cleaver himself told me to polish it," Extra said. "Lord Millstone wanted it shiny for the guests." "Guests?" Timothy looked confused. I thought so." He didn't say more. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Did you notice anything unusual about the lantern?" "Smell weight." Timothy frowned. "Well, now that you say it, the glass dome felt wrong. Not like usual. It weren't cold after cleaning. Sort of warm, like it held heat." Holmes nodded slowly. "That will do, Timothy. You've been most helpful." The boy scurried off, and Holmes turned to me with a look that I had come to recognize as the dawning of revelation. "The lantern," he said quietly, "was not what it appeared to be. It may not even have been a lantern at all, not entirely." He walked briskly back toward the greenhouse, motioning for us to follow. "I must examine the inside glass pane from the outside," he said. "Not the interior reflection, but what it shows to the world." When we reached the greenhouse, Holmes circled it with slow precision, pausing at the easternmost pane. He knelt, staring intently at something invisible to my eye. "Watson," he whispered, "observe the third pane from the corner. Do you see anything off?" I crouched beside him. At first, nothing. Then, I saw it. A faint distortion or crack, no warp, but a subtle difference in the way it reflected the winter light, like it was made of different glass altogether. "It's not original," I murmured. "Indeed," Holmes replied. "It has been replaced recently, and likely with far more material ... absorbing." He stood and exhaled deeply, as though the fog itself might carry away the weight of what he now suspected. "Watson," he said softly, "we are not looking for a weapon. We are looking for a message hidden in the very absence of light. And Cleaver, I believe, saw it." Chapter 4. The Orchid Keepers and the Shadowed House. The morning mist was slow to lift from Millstone Estate, and the light that did manage to filter through the clouds carried no warmth. Holmes, after his examination of the greenhouse's exterior pane, had requested that all household members and staff be gathered in the morning room for questioning. The idea, he explained to Lestrade and me as we walked back to the manor, was to see the pieces not in isolation, but in proximity like tiles of a mosaic whose picture only emerged from distance. "Human beings," he remarked, "are like mirrors, Watson. We reflect the light or darkness of those around us. The more we understand their shared tensions, the closer we come to understanding the hidden." Asher, the butler, had already seen to it. When we entered the room, 5 figures sat or stood around the perimeter. A fire had been lit to drive out the chill, and though the room bore an illusion of comfort, the air was tense. At the far end stood Victor Millstone, hands behind his back, gaze fixed on the coals. Beside the sideboard sat Mrs. Lavinia Spade, the housekeeper, her large frame nearly swallowing the rosewood chair she occupied. Her grey hair was pinned in a severe bun, and her eyes flicked constantly from face to face. She had served the Millstones since before Victor's birth. To the left, leaning against the window frame, was Mr. Caleb Dorsey, the estate's orchid specialist. Wiry and balding, He had ink stains on 2 fingers and a faint burn scar across his right cheek. He offered us a curt nod. Then, beside the bookcase, stood Miss Elsie March, a maid barely out of her teens, with trembling hands and wide reddened eyes. She clutched a kerchief and kept glancing at Victor when she thought no one noticed. Last of all was Dr. Thaddeus Penwell, the family physician, summoned from the village at Holmes's request. A stooped man with large spectacles and a sour mouth. He tapped his cane twice as Holmes entered and offered a thin smile. Holmes stood by the hearth. "Good morning. My name is Sherlock Holmes. With your permission, I shall ask each of you a few questions regarding the events of last night. Let us begin with something simple. Mr. Dorsey, when did you last see Mr. Cleaver alive?" Dorsey rubbed his chin. "Yesterday afternoon, around for..." He was checking the water pipes along the orchid bed. "Said something about a leak that might freeze if left overnight. Did you speak beyond that?" "No, we weren't exactly fond of each other. He thought my heating methods were overcomplicated. Said I fussed too much." "Did you?" Holmes asked. Dorsey grinned faintly. "Possibly, but orchids don't grow from neglect." Holmes turned to the housekeeper. "Mrs. Spade, where were you between 9 and 10 last night?" "In my quarters, sir. I retire at 9 precisely. It's a routine I've kept for decades." "Did you hear anything from the greenhouse?" "Nothing. It's a well-insulated house, Mr. Holmes. Besides, the glass there muffles sound like you wouldn't believe." Next, he turned to Miss March. "And you, Miss, what were your duties last night?" She swallowed. I was with Lady Mil. I bring her the sleeping draught at 9:15. Master Victor was there as well." "Did she drink the entire dose?" Holmes asked. I think so." Holmes looked at her closely. "You think so?" Miss March looked flustered. She waved me away before she finished it. I didn't want to disturb her further. Holmes did not press the point but jotted something in his pocketbook. "Dr. Penwell," Holmes said, "you have treated Lady Millstone for some time." 5 years, the physician answered with a slight sniff. "She suffers from a nervous wasting disorder, purely somatic. I've prescribed laudanum and valerian root extract for her sleep. She's sedated most nights. Yes, though the dosage has been halved in the past month, her heart has grown weaker." "Would she be physically capable of walking unaided?" Penwell raised an eyebrow. "No, she could hardly cross the room without assistance." "Why do you ask?" "Because in every locked room mystery," Holmes replied softly, "the one we assume cannot move is often the only one who had opportunity." A sharp intake of breath from Miss March suggested the implication had landed. Finally, Holmes turned to Victor. "And you, sir, can you account for your whereabouts last night?" Victor's jaw tightened. "As I've said before, I was with my mother. Then in the library, alone." "Yes." Holmes folded his arms. "Mr. Millstone, how well did you know Henry Cleaver?" Victor hesitated. "He'd been here all my life. Quiet, loyal, perhaps too loyal. He rarely spoke unless asked a question." "Did you have any conflicts with him?" "None, but..." He stopped, glanced at Lestrade, then continued. "A few months ago, Cleaver intercepted a letter addressed to me. I never found out from whom, but I believe he opened it. Afterwards, he seemed ... unsettled. He avoided me." "What kind of letter?" Holmes asked quietly. "I don't know. It vanished. But I suspect someone was warning me about something, or someone." Holmes nodded and stepped back, casting a slow glance around the room. "We have a man dead in a locked estate, a lantern that behaves impossibly, a family wrapped in secrets. What is needed now is not merely evidence, but light. True light." He turned to Lestrade. "I shall require access to the greenhouse once more, but this time at night, precisely as the crime occurred. Have it prepared, and ensure no one disturbs the lantern." Holmes stepped out, and I followed him into the corridor. I asked, "Do you have your culprit?" "No," Holmes said, "but I have something better. I have the shadow that reveals where the light has been blocked. And now, we wait to see who fears its return." Chapter 5. The Visitor in the Night. The fire in the drawing-room had long since turned to embers, yet Poirot remained awake, seated in a high-backed chair with his hands steepled beneath his chin. Hastings had retired 2 hours ago, convinced that nothing more could be gleaned that evening. But Poirot's little grey cells were still working, churning through everything they had learned since arriving in Beaulieu-sur-Mer. The coastal breeze whispered against the shutters, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and lavender. It was past midnight when Poirot finally rose from his chair and tiptoed down the dim corridor. He paused briefly at the door to Monsieur Lefebvre's study. A sliver of candlelight glowed from beneath the doorframe. Carefully, he rapped once. No answer. He pushed gently. The door creaked open to reveal Lucien Lefebvre hunched over a desk, scribbling something into a battered ledger. He looked up, startled. "Ah, Monsieur, you startled me." "My apologies, monsieur," said Poirot gently, "but I found myself unable to sleep. I wondered if you might suffer from the same affliction." Lucien gave a faint smile, and gestured to a second chair. "Please, I have grown used to the quiet hours. They are often more honest than the daylight." Poirot sat. "You were close to Madame Leblanc, n'est-ce pas?" Lucien paused, pen still in hand. "We all were, in our own ways. In yours specifically." Poirot pressed gently. Lucien's mouth twitched. "She confided in me, that is all. I believe she found solace in speaking to someone who would not echo her secrets through the garden walls." "Secrets?" Poirot asked softly. Lucien set the pen down and steepled his own fingers. There were things about this house, about its past, that disturbed her. She believed she was being watched. At first, I thought it was just the isolation, but later, I began to believe her. Did she mention who might be watching her? Lucien shook his head. "No names, just shadows. But she was scared, monsieur, truly. And then she changed her will. Only I and her lawyer, in nice new—" Not even Clemence Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And you believe that change led to her death?" Lucien's eyes flicked toward the candle flame. "All I know is that 2 weeks later, she was dead." Poirot left him there, the candlelight casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. The hallway seemed darker than before, the silence heavier. He moved past the guest bedrooms, past Hastings' softly snoring form, and into the heart of the old estate. He reached the atrium, with its black and white tiled floor and cold moonlit statues. Something glimmered on the floor. He bent down, a broken cuff-linked silver bearing a family crest, not Lucien's, and certainly not something that would fall by accident in the middle of the night. He pocketed it. Suddenly, a low creak echoed from the hallway above. Poirot straightened, heart steady, ears alert. Someone was moving on the upper floor. He slipped into the shadows by the stairwell and waited. A figure descended. Slow, silent, swathed in a long dark coat. The person was holding something in their hand. Poirot couldn't tell what. As they passed beneath the archway, the moonlight struck their face for a split second. It was Madame Clemence. Her expression was pale, almost waxen, her eyes unfocused. She moved toward the old chapel room, long unused, its door warped with age. Poirot followed, soundless as the sea. She pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, but she didn't seem to notice. Inside, the chapel was cold and dark. Candles stood half-burned in wrought iron holders. At the front was a stone altar. Clemence knelt. From beneath her coat, she pulled out something wrapped in a silk scarf, an old wooden box, small, carved with ancient symbols. Poirot watched her set it on the altar. She began to whisper. Her voice was barely audible, a litany in French, but laced with old words that Poirot recognized only from the dim recesses of his classical education. Then she broke into soft sobs. He stepped forward. "Madame Clemence," she spun, eyes wild. The box fell from the altar with a dull thud. "What are you doing here?" she gasped. "I might ask the same, madame." She clutched her coat closed. "You shouldn't be here. This is sacred." Poirot bent and picked up the box. It was heavier than it looked. "What is this?" he asked Dot. She snatched it from his hands. "A memory, that is all. You came here at night, alone, to mourn or to hide." She stared at him. "I don't know what game you were playing, monsieur, but I warn you this house is older than you think, older than any of us." Poirot inclined his head. "Age does not frighten me, but murder does." She stepped back. "You think I killed her? I think someone is going to great lengths to keep secrets buried." She turned away. "You should leave. I shall for now." Poirot backed out of the chapel, closing the door behind him. He returned to his room just as the first light of dawn was coloring the windows. Hastings was still asleep, curled under his blanket. Poirot sat by the window and removed the cufflink from his pocket. Silver, engraved with a crest he did not yet recognize, and wrapped in the night's events, was a mystery far older than the dead woman upstairs. He murmured to himself, "There is something beneath this house, beneath its surface, its family, its rituals. I can feel it." And as the sun finally crept over the horizon, Poirot resolved that today he would dig deeper, literally, if he had to. Chapter 6. The echo in the ivy blaze. lingered in the overgrown backyard of the Wycliffe estate, the scent of crushed ivy rising beneath his boots. The evening light was dimming now, casting long, gold-drenched shadows across the gravel path and illuminating a silence to welcome. There was something deceptive in the serenity of the place, a stillness that didn't belong to grief, but to something carefully constructed. He turned to the gardener, an older man named Emery with sun-dried skin and a nervous grip on his rake. "When did you last see Mr. Wycliffe's widow?" Blaise asked, watching the man closely. Emery hesitated, pulling at the cap on his head. "Week after the funeral, sir. She was standing right where you are now, just staring at that wall of ivy. Didn't say a word." Blaise glanced at the dense thicket that ran along the rear of the estate. The ivy hung like a veil, nearly reaching the second-floor windows. "What's behind it?" "A wall, sir, but it used to be a greenhouse. Collapsed in the storm 4 years ago, never rebuilt. They let the vines have it." Something in Emery's tone, it was too casual, rehearsed even. Blaise narrowed his gaze. "Is there a door back there?" "Yes, but it doesn't open, rusted shut." Emery looked past Blaise's shoulder, his eyes flicking toward the house. "Begging your pardon, sir, but it's nearly dusk. I'd rather not be out here after what?" A pause, then a shrug. "Nothing, sir. Just old bones and stories. Good evening." Emery shuffled off, and Blaise was left with the crawling sense that something very specific was being left unsaid. He approached the ivy wall, brushed back a thick curtain of green, and found it, a rust-bitten iron door, barely visible under layers of growth. A heavy padlock dangled from the handle. He tried it. No movement. He noted the marks around the keyhole. Scratches, as if someone had recently attempted to open it. Someone without the key. He stepped back and made a note in his leather-bound pad before heading. Inside the house, the parlor was dim, thick with the scent of dust and jasmine. Nora Wycliffe sat with a book on her lap, her posture stiff despite the luxurious velvet armchair beneath her. She didn't look up as Blaise entered. "You were close to your husband's assistant, Claire," Blaise said, without preamble. "She spent more time here than most family members." Nora's fingers tightened around the book's spine. "She was efficient and deeply devoted," he added. Finally, Nora lifted her gaze. "Are you implying I wasn't?" "I'm implying someone was sending anonymous letters to your husband, revealing intimate details about you, and that same someone disappeared the day he died." Nora didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled a dry, amused twist of the lips. "You think Claire wrote them?" Blaise didn't answer. She stood and crossed to the fireplace, where a photograph sat on the mantel, a black-and-white image of Charles and herself on their wedding day. She stared at it with tired eyes. "My husband was a man of control. Mr. Blaise, his assistants, his staff lived under the weight of his demands. Claire was no different. If she vanished, it was because she couldn't carry it anymore." Blaise moved to the opposite side of the room, his steps slow. "She didn't pack. Her car is still in the garage. Her handbag was found beneath your husband's desk." Nora exhaled. "Then perhaps you should check the pond." It was a cold thing to say. Not panicking, not even bitter, just cold. Blaise walked the outer grounds again after nightfall, tracing the footpath from the back terrace to the edge of the forest, where the land sloped downward into a shallow depression. There, at the center, lay the Wycliffe Pond, more a marshy basin than a picturesque feature. Fog hovered above it in wisps, low and quiet. He studied the muddy banks, drag marks, small ones, as if something had been pulled. He crouched and dipped a gloved finger into the shallow prints. Recently, a boot print beside them, smaller than his. Feminine, the fog curled around his legs like something living. He stood, senses sharpened. There was someone else nearby, watching, listening. He stepped back slowly, only to hear a soft thud from the trees beyond. Blaise turned sharply. "Who's there?" Silence. Then a whisper, barely audible. Turned back. It didn't echo. It didn't repeat. Just that one warning, delivered in a voice, soft as moth wings and cold as stone. Blaise didn't move. His eyes scanned the trees, but there was no one. He remained still a full minute longer before retreating, boots crunching softly over gravel and broken leaves. When he reached the manor again, the windows were dark, except for one, a faint glow in the east wing, Claire's old room. Inside, he climbed the stairs with deliberate quiet, feeling the age of the house in every creak beneath his feet. He turned left, followed the corridor, and paused outside the former assistant's bedroom. The door was ajar. He knocked once. No answer. He pushed it open. The room was neat, frozen in time. Books stacked with precision, bed perfectly made, desk chair tucked in. He crossed to the window and looked out, down to the ivy wall. Now nothing more than a shadowy curtain in the moonlight. Then something caught his eye. An envelope, tucked behind a candle on the WINDOWSILL. Blaze opened it slowly. Inside, a single piece of paper, typed words, and only 5 of them. She knew. She saw everything. Blaze turned the paper over. Nothing on the back, no signature, but the font the exact same as the anonymous letters sent to Charles Wycliffe. He folded it, tucked it into his coat, and stood in the room's center for a moment longer, listening to the eerie quiet that filled the house like a second skin. Something inside this estate was festering, a lie buried too deep, a truth chained too tightly. And now, the chains were beginning to rattle. Chapter 7. The vanishing signature. Rain drummed gently against the windows of the boarding house as Poirot leaned over the breakfast table, a spoonful of soft-boiled egg hovering forgotten in mid-air. Across from him, Hastings flipped through the local paper, his brow furrowed with concern. No mention of the incident at the station. Poirot, Hastings muttered. Either the press hasn't caught wind of it, or someone's keeping it quiet. Both possibilities are plausible, Poirot said, setting down his spoon. But I am more interested in what is not being said than what is. He pushed away his breakfast and retrieved the worn notebook he'd been using to jot observations. The events of the last 12 hours had added weight to what had initially seemed like a simple theft, or perhaps not even a crime at all. A train that never stopped, a ticketmaster who denied its existence, and now Mrs. Langley's mention of a man she'd seen board the phantom train, a man who had vanished without a trace. Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Langley herself, dressed in a practical coat and gloves, her face drawn but determined. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Mr. Poirot, but I've remembered something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About the man I saw. Please, madame, do come in." Poirot gestured her to a chair. "Sit, speak slowly." She sat and twisted her gloves in her lap. It was just a flash, really. But the man who boarded, he had a valise, brown leather, but what struck me was the way he moved, like he was in pain, limping slightly, favoring his left leg. Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings. "A limp, you say?" "Yes, and I remember now. There was a woman, too." She helped him up the steps. Poirot's eyes sharpened. "A woman? Can you describe her?" Mrs. Langley frowned. "You'll think me silly, but she looked like she stepped out of a painting. High collar, feathered hat, very old-fashioned. Curious indeed." Poirot murmured. "Merci, madame, this helps greatly." After she left, Hastings leaned in. A limping man with a brown valise, accompanied by a woman dressed like it's 1890. "What on earth do you make of it?" "I make use of it," said Poirot. "That we are dealing with a story whose roots may be far older than its surface suggests." Their next stop was the ticket office again. This time Poirot insisted on speaking with the station master, a gruff man named Mr. Daring, whose uniform was immaculate and whose patience was short. 11:17. "Never heard of it. No such train on our timetable," Daring said firmly. "We've got the 10:42 and the midnight mail. Nothing in between." "But Madame Langley saw a man board it," Poirot replied, "and the train itself, others witnessed it." "Look," Daring snapped, "we check every train in and out. Nothing comes through this station that isn't on the schedule. You think we're hiding trains now?" Poirot raised a hand. "Forgive the implication, but might I see the train logbook, if only to satisfy a curiosity?" Reluctantly, Daring fetched the leather-bound book and laid it open. Poirot turned to the page for the previous evening. The columns for train number, arrival, and departure were meticulously filled. But then he noticed something, a faint smudge, an erased line. He retrieved his magnifying glass and peered closely. Beneath the entries for the 10:42 and the midnight train, a rubbed-out line shimmered faintly under the right light. "Mon ami," he said softly to Hastings, "someone has made an effort to remove an entry." The smudge was in the exact position that 11:17 would have occupied. Poirot looked up at Daring, whose face had gone pale. "There was a train," Poirot said evenly. "Someone tried to hide it." Daring's mouth twitched. I don't know what you're talking about." Poirot snapped the book shut. "If you do not wish to speak here, I understand. But know this, a man is missing, and I do not believe he boarded a ghost train." They returned to their boarding house to find a telegram, waiting for them, sent from London. No signature, Check archives. 11 to 17 previously ran Tilbury Line. Suspended after 1914. Reinstated. Once November 2nd, 1924, private hire. Vanished the same night. Poirot tapped the telegram with one finger. Hastings, we are chasing not merely a train, but a shadow from the past. You don't mean I mean precisely this. There was an 1117 once. It ran that route, but it was taken out of service until someone hired it for one night. November 2nd and then poof gone. But that's absurd. A whole train can't vanish. Poirot raised a brow. And yet, here we are. He stood and walked to the window, staring at the grey clouds rolling in over the hills. A man boards a train that is not supposed to exist, accompanied by a woman dressed like she stepped out of another century. The station logs were altered. The train itself has a history of vanishing. And now, our mysterious passenger is missing. Poirot turned back, eyes gleaming. There is something very wrong with 1117, and I intend to find out what. That evening, Poirot and Hastings paid a visit to the small, dusty rail archive housed near the rear of the station. An elderly clerk, thin as a rail himself, allowed them into the back room where records were kept. It was there, under flickering gaslight, that Poirot unearthed a yellowed timetable from 1920. He pointed to the entry. November 2nd, Special Charter Tilbury to Harrogate. Private client, E. de Lacy. Hastings echoed, "Who's that?" But Poirot said nothing. He was staring at a note scrawled in pencil on the margin. Signature not matching. Authorization questioned. Train departed. Never arrived. Poirot whispered. The signature vanished. The train vanished. And now, it returns. He closed the ledger with a soft thud. We are not dealing with the present, Hastings. We are unraveling a crime buried in time. And time, mon ami, leaves behind its fingerprints. Chapter 8. A letter from the ashes. The fog had thickened since the morning, wrapping the city in a shroud of cold dampness that seemed to soak into the bones. Poirot stood near the fireplace in Sir Cedric's study, his hands behind his back, studying the smoke-stained edges of a charred envelope Inspector Grange had handed him just minutes earlier. This was found hidden in the grate, the inspector said, adjusting his coat collar. The maid noticed an odd odor. Turns out, it had only been half burned. Some of it is legible. Poirot carefully unfolded the letter, what remained of it, with his gloved fingers. The paper was fragile, scorched at the corners, but the center bore enough ink to decipher. The handwriting was elegant, curled and controlled, the way one writes when hiding something beneath poise. Cedric, you promised the past would not return, and yet, the anniversary looms and the letters grow bolder. I know what you did. We know. If you will not act, I will. J. Poirot's eyebrows arched slightly, then flattened again in thought. The phrasing was sharp with threat, but not anonymous. A single initial, J, the kind used when the writer believes they do not need to identify themselves further. Someone close, Poirot muttered. Grange leaned in, voice low. J for Jameson. Poirot shook his head gently. No, Jameson is not poetic enough for this letter. His concern is protocol. This is personal, desperate. A last warning. He turned to Lady Finch, seated stiffly in an armchair near the study window, a velvet shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes flicked toward the letter, as if it might burn her again. You knew of these threats, madame? Poirot asked softly. Aye, she hesitated, then exhaled. He kept secrets from everyone, but not always from me. Cedric had received letters for weeks. He dismissed them, burned them all. I caught glimpses. They were always signed J. Did he speak of the past? Of what this mean? A pause. He would go quiet around this time of year. There was something that happened, long ago. Something dreadful, but he never told me fully. Only once, after too much port, he muttered something about a train, a woman, and silence buying peace. Poirot stepped closer. A woman, I don't know her name, but he always grew solemn on January 16th. That was yesterday. Poirot turned to Grange. The will. Sir Cedric revised it days before his death. Have you located his solicitor? Grange nodded. A Mr. Lyler met with Sir Cedric 3 nights ago. I have him coming in this afternoon. Good. Poirot turned back to the fire. And the daughter? In her room, shaken but quiet. Poirot's gaze lingered on the flame. Then he whispered, the train, the woman, the silence, ***. Later that afternoon, Poirot sat alone in the conservatory, surrounded by thick palms and the faint scent of citrus. The letter lay in front of him, next to a small notebook in which he had begun to sketch timelines. He was still reviewing the burned letter when footsteps echoed across the tile floor. Mr. Lyle, the solicitor, had arrived neatly dressed, eyes wary. "Mr. Poirot," he greeted. "I came as soon as I was summoned. Mercy, sit, please." The man lowered himself onto the bench, smoothing his coat. Poirot wasted no time. "You met with Sir Cedric on the evening of the 17th. "Yes, at his request. He had made changes to his will." "May I ask who benefited from these changes?" Lyle hesitated. Lady Finch was removed as primary heir. Instead, he designated the bulk of his estate to someone named Mary Ann Thorne, a name I did not recognize. Poirot's mustache twitched. "And you did not inquire?" "I did. Sir Cedric simply said, 'It is time I settled my conscience.'" He seemed somber. "Do you know where this Mary Ann Thorne can be found?" No address was provided, only a bank account in her name for a trust fund. But the bank verified the account was recently activated. With the London address, Poirot scribbled the name in his notebook. "Mary Ann Thorne, merci Mr. Lyle, you have been most helpful. **** by dusk." Poirot stood at the entrance to the local train station, Green Hollow Junction, a narrow, wind-bitten platform from another time. An attendant, pale-faced and young, led him to the old station records room where logs and complaints were filed in thick ledgers. "Do you keep logs for incidents involving the 6:45 express train?" "Goes back years." The boy nodded. "That train never stops." "Not here, not anywhere between Derby and St. Albans express line." "Sir, any incidents?" Poirot asked, flipping pages. The boy pointed to a complaint from 2 decades earlier. "January 16th, 1905. A passenger fell from a moving express train." "No, stop." The witness claimed she screamed before vanishing past milepost 64. The name was smudged. The ink faded. Poirot traced the outline of what remained. "Miss M.T.H." His breath caught. "M. Thorne, ***, that night." Back in his room, Poirot stared out at the fog-slicked grounds. The pieces were forming threads from the past, tugging violently into the present. A dead man haunted by a tragedy he had tried to erase. A woman lost from a train that never stopped. A daughter who had just learned she was not heir. And a mysterious name, Mary Ann Thorne, emerged like a ghost from the ashes. But there were still gaps. Poirot whispered into the stillness. "Why now?" He moved to the desk and circled 3 letters in his notebook. JMT, somewhere in those initials was the name of a ghost that refused to stay. Buried, and Hercule Poirot would find her. Chapter 9. The code beneath the ink. The room felt colder after Basil exited. Poirot remained seated, fingers steepled, his eyes fixed on the small diary lying open before him. The revelation of Elizabeth's encoded journal hidden beneath poetry and mundane observations was no small development. Every line now demanded scrutiny, for in them might lie the motive, the method, and perhaps even the identity of the killer. Hastings peered over his shoulder, a crease forming between his brows. "But this cipher, do you recognize the pattern, Poirot?" Poirot tapped his chin, eyes sharp behind his spectacles. "Not yet, mon ami. But consider the elegance. Each entry is a poem." "Yes, but when you count the syllables and measure the rhythm, there is a rhythm not of emotion, but of concealment." He flipped to the next page and pointed. "Here, she references a cooked flame. What is that, Hastings? A culinary error?" "No, it is a metaphor. Likely, a signal. Perhaps a place, or person, related to heat anger, or perhaps something burned." Hastings leaned back, mildly overwhelmed. "You think every poem contains a clue?" "Not every," Poirot said, "but the important ones. The ones written after she returned from Paris." That is when something shifted. Suddenly, Miss Templeton re-entered, her voice breathless. "There's something you need to see. In Elizabeth's drawer we found an old envelope, tucked behind the lining. It was nearly invisible." She handed the small item to The envelope was yellowed and brittle with age. On the front, an unfamiliar name, Lucien Vere. Inside, a letter, in precise cursive, written in French. Poirot read silently, and his expression changed just slightly. He folded the letter carefully. It seems Elizabeth knew someone in Paris. He was not merely an acquaintance. He writes of late-night visits, of shared wine beneath the Seine, and a promise never fulfilled. Poirot sighed. Romantic, but tragic. And most curious, he warns her not to trust someone she mentions only as V. Hastings repeated. "Basil's last name begins with V. Vincent." Do you suppose it was him? Poirot tapped the letter. We must not jump like kangaroos, Hastings. V could be many things. A person, a place, even a code. As the hour grew late, the manor seemed to fold inward. The shadows deepened in the hallways. Poirot requested that everyone retire, and for once, they complied. Exhaustion had settled over the house like a fog. But Poirot, ever meticulous, could not sleep. He spread Elizabeth's journal, the letter, and Basil's note out on the study desk, arranging them as a cartographer might arrange pieces of an unfinished map. Suddenly, he paused. The poem on the third page. The flame burns cold in Vincent's shade. The mirror knows the lie I made, and yet beneath the foxglove bloom, I buried silence in the room. The foxglove, Poirot whispered. Mon Dieu, Hastings. Hastings sat up from the sofa where he had dozed off. What is it? Foxglove is deadly. A poison digitalis. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And if Elizabeth wrote, she buried silence in the room. Perhaps she meant a literal planting, something concealed beneath the floorboards or inside the wall. They hurried to Elizabeth's room. Quietly, Poirot knelt beside the far wall, near the vanity, and began tapping gently. A dull thud gave way to a hollow sound. Poirot used a small knife from his pocket to loosen a floorboard. Inside was a velvet pouch. Hastings exhaled. What's inside? Poirot opened it carefully. Within was a tiny glass vial, half full of a pale golden liquid, and a folded note that read, "In case he comes again." Poirot's face darkened. "Hastings, this is foxglove extract. Enough to kill a man." They returned to the study, Poirot holding the vial like a holy relic. Elizabeth feared for her life. She was preparing for something, or someone. But if she was prepared, Hastings asked, why did she end up dead? Because she was too careful, Poirot replied, and someone else was more desperate. There was a knock at the door. This time it was Armand, Elizabeth's older cousin. His face was pale, eyes sleepless. "I couldn't sleep," he said softly. "The past is pressing too heavily. I lied earlier." Poirot gestured to a chair. "Speak freely, monsieur." Armand sat slowly. "Elizabeth and I were close, yes, but not as you imagine. She discovered something a few months ago, something about our family. It terrified her. She said there were things in the manor's history that should never come to light." "What things?" Poirot asked. Armand looked down. "There's an old vault beneath the manor, locked for decades. She asked me to help her open it, but before we could, she vanished to Paris. When she returned, she seemed quieter, as if whatever she'd learned had silenced her." Poirot nodded slowly. "Do you have the key?" "I don't," Armand said, "but my father did, and he died. In this house." The weight of the revelation pressed against the walls. Poirot stood. "Then it is time we look beneath the surface, mon ami, for I believe the truth is buried, not in the words, but in what lies beneath them," just as Elizabeth knew. And as the clock struck 3, the great detective turned his gaze toward the cellar door. Untouched for years. Chapter 10. A locked drawer and a whispered, named the morning after Blaise's confrontation with Father Matteo. The detective returned to the boarding house early, long before the tenants stirred. The streets were damp with dew, and the air hung heavy with silence. He needed solitude to revisit the widow's room, not the parts that were open to all, but the corners that whispered secrets when left alone. Miss Greta was already awake, shuffling around the kitchen in her slippers. She looked up when Blaise entered, her face weary but curious. "I thought you'd be back," she said quietly. "Her room's untouched. I made sure of it." Blaise gave a small nod. "I'll keep it that way." She handed him a brass key from her pocket, bottom drawer of her wardrobe. She always kept it locked. That caught his attention. He thanked her and made his way up the creaking stairs, the key warm in his palm. When he stepped into the widow's room again, it smelled of old lavender and paper, a space preserved by grief or fear, or maybe both. The wardrobe stood tall against the far wall. Its polished surface reflected the faint sunlight, a quiet sentinel holding a final secret. Blaise knelt before it and inserted the key. It clicked with an oddly loud sound, as if it had waited a long time to be turned. Inside, the drawer held a small stack of envelopes, yellowed and bound with a faded blue ribbon. Blaise untied them and read through the letters. They were all from the same man, Emiliano. The handwriting was smooth, confident, and distinctly Spanish. Each letter brimmed with longing and regret, and all were dated over a span of 3 years, ending abruptly just 1 year before the widow's death. In one letter, Emiliano mentioned a name, Teodora, not the widow. She was always addressed as me Alma, my soul. Teodora, according to Emiliano's writing, had been the reason they fled Spain, the reason his silence was necessary. Blaze's mind raced. The name didn't appear in any legal documents he'd reviewed so far, nor had anyone mentioned it in conversation. Another woman, a daughter, a rival. He folded the letters carefully, deciding to bring them to If anyone could translate their emotional undertones properly, it was her. As he stood to leave, something else caught his eye, a small scrap of paper stuck between the drawer and its wooden frame. He fished it out. It was a torn corner of an envelope, addressed to Sister Marielle, the ink smudged but still legible. The return address bore the crest of the old convent in Barcelona, the same one where the widow had once taught music, and where, Blaze now suspected, much of her story still remained buried. He left the boarding house with the letters secured in his coat, and a new thread unraveling in his mind. The widow hadn't merely escaped Spain, she had brought with her unfinished business, a love abandoned, and perhaps a daughter whose name no one dared speak aloud. Clarette was waiting for him at her flower stall, trimming stems with distracted fingers. When she saw his expression, she tucked away her shears and nodded for him to sit. "I found something," Blaze said, handing her the letters. She scanned the first page, and her breath caught. "This is ... poetry, not just love letters." He was protecting her. From who? Clarette didn't answer immediately. She kept reading, slower this time. Then she looked up. Teodora wasn't a threat. She was theirs. Their daughter. Blaze's brows knitted. Then why leave her behind? Because they feared for her. Emiliano must have stayed in Spain with her. That's what all this means. Blaze sat back, heart pounding with quiet urgency. So either Teodora came looking for her mother, or someone found out who she was. Clarette handed him the letters back. "One of those is more dangerous than the other." Blaze didn't speak, but he knew which one she meant. A daughter seeking her mother would knock gently. A secret discovered would break the door down. Before he left, Clarette touched his arm. "There's more," she whispered. "That priest you mentioned, Mateo, I've heard his name before. Not from the church here, but from a refugee who passed through town last year. She said he wasn't a priest at all." Blaze froze. What was he? Then, "A hunter," Clarette said softly, "of people who ran." The pieces began to form a new image in Blaze's mind, an image dark and tangled. Father Mateo, the suspicious man watching from the shadows, a locked drawer hiding love and loss, a daughter lost in history, and a murder that now felt more like a warning that night. Blaze returned to his apartment and spread the evidence across his desk. Letters, documents, photos, the broken rosary, every fragment like a constellation waiting to be connected. And at the center of it all, the widow, whose silence had not been one of guilt, but of protection. Someone had come for what she'd hidden, someone who wasn't finished yet. The knock at his door came just before midnight. Blaze didn't move. He waited, listening. 3 knocks, then silence. He stood slowly, every nerve alert, and opened the door just enough to peer out. No one was there, only a folded piece of paper on the floor, with one word written in red ink: Teodora. Chapter 11. The widow's web. Blaze leaned against the brick wall of the narrow alleyway behind the bakery, arms folded, eyes fixed on the entrance to the apartment above. Night had deepened, and the scent of burnt sugar still hung in the air. Mrs. Dorell's warning echoed in his mind like a cryptic lullaby. A secret kept long enough becomes its own truth. He wasn't sure if she was being poetic, desperate, or cunning, but one thing was clear. The widow was playing a deeper game than she let on. "Did you believe her?" Veronica asked softly from beside him. Her trench coat collar was turned up against the breeze, eyes sharp with thought. Blaze didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head, as if listening to the building breathe. "I believed. Parts," he said, but the rest felt rehearsed. Her performance was polished, too polished. Veronica nodded. "She's smart, controlled, but terrified underneath. That kind of restraint only comes from years of hiding something." Blaze turned his gaze to the window on the second floor. Dark now, curtains drawn. The question is, what's she hiding? And how does Henry fit into this? Just then, a figure emerged from the shadows of the adjoining alley. A lanky man in a corduroy coat, slightly hunched and breathing heavily. "Detective Blaze," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "Yes, I got your note at the library. I'm Emery Hatch. I used to work for Peter ... in accounting. I shouldn't be here if my wife finds out." She'll lose it, but you said it's important. Blaze motioned him into the shadows. Tell us what you know. Emery swallowed, eyes darting. There were ... discrepancies. At first, I thought they were minor errors, but they kept stacking up: false invoices, rerouted donations, fake vendors. Veronica's eyes widened. Money laundering. Emery nodded. Exactly, but when I brought it up with Peter, he told me to forget it. Said I'd misunderstood. A week later, I was downsized. But here's the thing: most of the fake vendors traced back to companies that only existed on paper. All of them connected to a woman named Lydia Gray. Veronica and Blaze exchanged a glance. That's Mrs. Durrell's maiden name, Blaze said flatly. Emery looked startled. Then, you understand why I've been scared, more than you know. Blaze muttered. Emery slipped them a folder before vanishing back into the alley. Inside were copies of balance sheets, transaction logs, and handwritten notes, some of them in what looked like Henry's handwriting. Veronica flipped through the pages. This could bury her. Blaze's jaw tightened. No, this could make someone want to bury her, or Peter. As they made their way back to the car, Blaze's mind reeled. He was beginning to see the shape of the thing: dark tendrils of fraud, betrayal, and fear binding everyone together. Back at the office, they pinned up a new timeline. At the center, Lydia Doroni Gray. Around her, the orbiting satellites of her past: Peter's foundation, the fraudulent companies, Emery's dismissal, and Henry's disappearance. And then, just as Veronica started sketching out the financial links, Blaze noticed a pattern. Look at this, he said, tapping the dates. Every major transaction to a shell company happened exactly a week before a known visit to the Dorrell house. Henry's trips home, they weren't casual. He was delivering something. Veronica whispered. Documents, payoffs, or maybe ... leverage. Blaze nodded. And if he was the one keeping records, maybe he became too much of a liability. Veronica looked up at him. Do you think Peter killed him? Blaze shook his head. Not directly. Peter doesn't get his hands dirty, but someone in this chain might have. They both fell silent. Then Blaze muttered, we need to get to Peter, now, before he erases anything. But as he reached for the phone, a knock came at the office door. It was the janitor from the community center. Pale, trembling. I was told to give you this, he said, handing Blaze a sealed envelope. Blaze opened it and pulled out a single photo. It was Henry, alive, somewhere. Unfamiliar concrete walls, dim light, eyes wide with fear. And across the bottom, in messy red ink, asked the widow what she promised, and to whom. Blaze's blood chilled. The widow wasn't just hiding a secret, she was bound by it, and the past wasn't done with her yet. Chapter 12. The mark beneath the paint. The following morning brought a strange calm to Wolf's brownstone, a deceptive hush that belied the mounting tension surrounding the case. Breakfast had been taken in silence, save for Wolf's quiet demand for more saffron in the eggs. Archie, meanwhile, had spent half the night going over his notes and photographs, poring over every oddity and fragment that might unlock the whole truth. Just after 10, Wolf summoned Archie into the office. The orchids had been freshly misted, and Wolf was already in his chair, eyes closed, fingertips pressed together in concentration. We are very close, Wolf said, without preamble. But as always, proximity means nothing without clarity. You remember the layout of Mrs. Wyatt's parlor? Every inch of it, Archie replied. I took enough pictures to wallpaper the joint. Wolf opened his eyes slowly. And yet we missed something. That smudge on the window, Archie offered, or that misaligned book on the shelf. No, Wolf said. The painting, Archie frowned. The one above the fireplace. Wolf nodded. Yes, a minor oil landscape. Forgettable in taste, but impossible to ignore in placement. The frame had dust along the top edge, but none beneath it. You're saying it was moved recently. I'm saying someone took it down, and likely for a reason. Archie stood. You want me to go back and check what's behind it? Wolf waved a dismissive hand. Unnecessary. I already had Fritz call Mrs. Wyatt this morning under the guise of retrieving my walking cane, which I conveniently left behind. You'll find the painting already removed. She's been instructed not to disturb anything. Smooth, Archie said with a grin. I'll head there now. The Wyatt residence was quiet when Archie arrived. Mrs. Wyatt, pale and drawn, opened the door and led him to the parlor without a word. The painting, as Wolf predicted, was leaning against the wall, revealing a smooth plaster square that didn't match the rest of the wall's aged paint. Archie crouched, A small indentation at the bottom caught his eye. He pressed gently on the panel, clicked dot. A compartment slid open. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth, was a folded piece of parchment and a narrow envelope. Archie opened the parchment carefully. It was a list: names, dates, and figures, written in looping cursive. The top was titled Inventory, Index Revisions, and Omitted Annotations. His eyes widened. The envelope held a single sheet, a letter addressed to R.W. in a sharp, commanding hand. It read, "The altered entries are complete. Wyatt suspects nothing. The rare index codes have been embedded using our pattern. We'll finish the last update by month's end. Burn this note after confirmation. E." Archie's heart skipped. E. Evelyn. No. Too obvious. Edward. Elias. Or was E a misdirect? He replaced everything carefully, snapped a few photos, then returned to the brownstone. Back in the office, Wolf accepted the documents with reverence, like they were holy writ. He studied the parchment closely, then turned to Archie. "This," Wolf said, tapping the letter, "is not only motive, it is also the key to the entire affair." "You think Wyatt found this stash before he died?" Archie asked. "I do," Wolf said, "and he likely confronted the conspirator, not realizing how far they were willing to go. The books were merely the surface of the rot. This list proves systematic tampering, writing culinary history, possibly for profit, reputation, or both, and the index." Archie asked, "What exactly did they change?" "Something that someone believed was worth killing for," Wolf said grimly. "And now, Mr. Goodwin, we must prepare." "Prepare for what?" Wolf leaned back. "To invite every suspect back here, under the pretense of final clarification. The killer must be shown that the game is up and be allowed to make one final mistake." Archie smiled. "The good old Wolf trap." "Indeed," Wolf said, "and this time, the bait is history itself." Chapter 13. The Final Index. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the office had been reset like a theater stage. Wolf sat behind his desk, a thundercloud of stillness beneath the orchid glow. Archie stood near the globe, his usual position for observing the human storms about to unfold. And seated in a semicircle were the suspects: Evelyn Wyatt, pale but defiant; Gregor Demas, the chef with a curdled temper; Millicent Carroway, with her endless pearls and tight-lipped smile; and Felix Durant, who had the nervous energy of a man auditioning for guilt. Wolf did not greet them. He merely lifted his gaze and began, "You may wonder why you've been summoned again. Allow me to be plain. The matter of Raymond Wyatt's death is resolved. I now know who killed him, and why. Before I name that individual, however, you must understand the context. The motive lies not in passion or impulse, but in a carefully organized deception." Felix shifted in his chair. Evelyn glanced quickly at Millicent. Gregor, arms crossed, scoffed aloud. Wolf continued, unfazed, in the late stages of compiling his cookbook, an encyclopedic effort that would have redefined culinary annotation. Mr. Wyatt began cross-referencing older, obscure culinary texts. These included several out-of-print indexes known only to a few scholars. The codes embedded in those indexes were ... idiosyncratic, number-letter strings, borrowed from private archival systems. Wolf now lifted the folded parchment Archie had found. This list, hidden behind a false panel in Mrs. Wyatt's parlor, details numerous alterations made to Mr. Wyatt's index, alterations that mirror not only the style of those older documents, but also specific mistakes found in them. In short, someone was corrupting Wyatt's book, intentionally embedding misleading information. Why? To match a fabricated lineage of culinary authority, thereby elevating certain chefs, erasing others, and rewriting food history to favor a particular narrative. Archie added, "That narrative conveniently benefits one or more people in this room." Millicent leaned forward. "This is absurd. Who even cares about indexes except academics?" "You underestimate the stakes," Wolf said sharply. "If Wyatt had published this book in its intended form, several careers would have been discredited, including yours, Miss Carroway. The entries he marked for removal were your supposed early citations, in European kitchens that never actually existed." Millicent's face turned cold. "You're lying." "I do not lie," Wolf said calmly. "But let me move on." He tapped the letter. "This note, signed E, references the index revisions and indicates that Wyatt was unaware of the tampering. That, too, was false. He had discovered it likely just days before his death. He confronted the forger. There was an argument, and in the end, he was silenced. Evelyn's voice broke the tension. But you said E didn't stand for Evelyn. No, Wolf said, studying her, though that was the intention of the killer. E was a decoy meant to cast suspicion on you, but the handwriting and the phrasing belonged to someone else entirely. Gregor leaned forward. You think I killed him over a cookbook? You had motive, certainly, Wolf said. Your recipes stood to be discredited, but you lacked the finesse and the fear. No, the killer is someone who understood both the technical structure of indexing and the power of revisionist narrative. He turned slowly to Felix Durant. You, Mr. Durant, were Wyatt's research assistant. You had access to the drafts, to the original texts. You suggested the archival references, and you had the skills to embed misinformation while appearing merely helpful. Felix went very still. That's insane. I was assisting. Evelyn can vouch for. I found the pen you use, Archie cut in. Same ink, same precious signatures, and the same note, fragments torn corners, same parchment stock at your apartment. You didn't expect Wolf to look beyond the painting. Felix's eyes darted between them, calculating. You didn't just kill him to hide your deception, Wolf said softly. You killed him because he was about to restore the truth. A truth that would have erased your name from the footnotes of culinary history. Silence. Then, Felix exhaled sharp, bitter. He never respected the work I did. Not once. I held that book together. He was going to gut it. Wolf gave a single, solemn nod. And now, you will explain that to the police. Chapter 14. Echoes. Through the glass the late evening mist had begun to creep along the sidewalk as Blaze and Sylvia stepped out of the dim yellow glow of the widow. Ashcroft's porch light. The humidity clung to their clothes like a second skin, and somewhere in the distance, a train wailed its mournful cry through the foggily appropriate, Blaze thought, for a case beginning to feel as ghostly as it was tangled. We need to talk to the gardener, Blaze muttered, his eyes scanning the garden hedges like they held secrets no hedge had a right to. Sylvia nodded. And the groundskeeper, anyone who had eyes on that greenhouse between the hours of 3 and 5 the day Henry died. They rounded the estate, gravel crunching beneath their shoes, until they reached the workers' quarters. A soft yellow light flickered through one of the small windows. Blaze knocked firmly. The door opened to a wiry man in his late 60s, with hands that looked carved from bark. Mr. Lyle Trent, Blaze asked. That's me, the man replied, his voice husky with a sound of soil and age. You're not here about the koi again, are you? No, sir, Blaze said with a faint smirk. We're investigating the death of Henry Ashcroft. We understand you've worked the gardens here for over 30 years. Lyle nodded, stepping aside to let them in. The room was cramped, books piled against every corner, and an unmistakable scent of pipe tobacco lingering in the air. I heard about the lad, shame, and a shock. He wasn't the type too well to just collapse in the greenhouse. Blaze studied him. You were around the day he died. Lyle lit a pipe and sank into a wooden chair. I was pruning back the south wall ivy until about 4:30. Saw Henry head into the greenhouse around 3. He looked off. Off how? Lyle squinted, pale, sweating a bit, kept looking over his shoulder like he was being followed, but he wasn't, not that I could see. Sylvia leaned forward. Did anyone else go in after him? Lyle puffed on his pipe, thoughtful. No one I saw, but the thing about this house is it's got corners that turn in on themselves. Secret paths, doors that open where you least expect. Blaze raised an eyebrow. You mean passageways? Lyle nodded slowly. Old ones. Been here since the house was built. Legend says a soldier who came back from war built them so his enemies could never track him. And are these passageways still accessible? The gardener gave a dry laugh. Not unless you know the right floorboards to step on. Blaze exchanged a quick glance with Sylvia. We need to see them. Lyle hesitated, then set down his pipe and stood. Follow me. They crossed through the rear hedge and into a disused tool shed that smelled of mildew and forgotten summers. Behind a stack of rotting wheelbarrows, Lyle pried up a panel in the floor. Beneath it, a narrow stone-walled passageway sloped downward. No one's used these in years, Lyle muttered, but they run under most of the house, including the greenhouse. Blaze stepped cautiously inside. The air was damp and smelled of ancient things. They moved slowly, their footsteps echoing like whispers in a tomb. After several bends and tight squeezes, they reached a ladder leading up into a wooden ceiling. This opens right into the greenhouse, don't it? Lyle whispered. Blaze turned to Sylvia. If someone used this to enter unseen, they could have slipped in and out without ever being spotted. She finished. Blaze's mind was racing. Poisoning Henry through the teacup was already a theory, but what if that was misdirection? What if someone had been in the greenhouse all along? Back above ground, Blaze and Sylvia stood again in the humid greenhouse, now darker than before. The air seemed heavier. Blaze reached into his coat, producing a small flashlight and scanning the corners. Then something caught Sylvia's odger, tiny fragment of cloth, caught on the edge of a broken terracotta pot. Red silk, the same shade as the scarf worn by Clarissa the day of the funeral. Blaze picked it up with tweezers. Clarissa said she was in her room all afternoon. Sylvia's voice was low. If she used the passage, no one would have seen her leave or return. Blaze nodded. The pieces were starting to fit, but too neatly. Let's not hang our hopes just yet, he said. There's still one person who's been very careful to stay quiet. Let me guess, Sylvia said grimly. The lawyer. Blaze gave her a wry look. Time to pay Mr. Halbridge another visit. As they turned to leave the greenhouse, a soft creak echoed through the glass, like a door being gently closed from somewhere unseen. Blaze froze. Sylvia reached for her small revolver out of habit, but there was nothing, only the echo. Yet Blaze couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been listening, and not from the outside. Chapter 15. The shattered facade. Lanterns along the East Ridge path flickered in the growing mist, casting trembling halos on the damp cobblestones. Blaze kept his pace even, coat buttoned against the chill, but his mind spun like the carousel at the Founders Square each turn, exposing a new face, a new angle, a fresh layer of lies. Beside him, Everett marched with steady determination, his jaw tight and eyes fixed ahead. She's not who we thought, Blaze said finally. Everett didn't need to ask who. Mara Reed, he replied grimly. Her name keeps turning up where it shouldn't. She told us she hadn't seen Lily in a year. Blaze continued. But the books say otherwise. Lily's name is on the lease for the guest house behind her vineyard. And then there's the bakery receipt. Everett nodded. Lily bought 2 loaves of rosemary rye just 2 weeks ago. That bakery only takes in-person orders, and Mara's address is listed for the pickup. And the ledger, Blaze added. Multiple transactions from a hidden account. Payments made to someone under the alias E.R. That's Everett Reed, her own brother. Everett halted. Wait, he said. You think she's been paying me off? Blaze turned to face him. I think someone using your name, possibly to frame you, but it tells us this whole thing is deeper than family secrets. They had reached the vineyard gates. The wrought iron curled like vines, and beyond them, the house stood quiet in the mist. A single window upstairs was lit a soft amber glow against the otherwise sleeping estate. You still have the key? Blaze asked. Everett pulled it from his coat and handed it over. She gave it to me years ago. Told me never to use it unless it was urgent. This qualifies. Blaze pushed the gate open with a reluctant creak. The mist seemed to thicken as they walked the gravel path, shoes crunching softly. Every shadow felt heavier now, like it carried memory. Inside, the house was still. They moved quickly, past the grand piano, past the long row of oil portraits, until they reached the stairs. Wait here, Blaze said. If she sees you, she might panic. Everett nodded silently. Blaze crept up the stairs. The banister cooled beneath his fingers. The light was coming from Mara's study. He stepped closer, careful to keep his shadow from casting under the door, and listened. A voice, not Mara's, it was deeper. Mail.com. I told you. The detective's getting too close. A pause. Then Mara's voice, steadier than usual. Brittle. He's relentless. And Everett's beginning to suspect something too. Blaze's heartbeat slowed. Every syllable mattered now. We paid you to make this go away, the man continued. But instead, you brought him to our doorstep. Another pause. Then paper rustling. Maybe photographs. We have one move left, Mara said. The same one we used before. A chair scraped, followed by approaching footsteps. Blaze stepped back just as the door opened. Mara stood frozen, her face illuminated by the soft glow behind her. Her eyes widened. Detective Blaze, he tilted his head, planning something. Behind her, a man stood lean, composed, with steel-grey hair and a weathered face. Blaze recognized from an old trial transcript. Arthur Mallon, once a city councilman, disgraced, disappeared, while Mallon said smoothly, "This complicates things. I'm used to complications," Blaze replied. Mara's mask faltered for the first time. Her voice cracked. It wasn't supposed to end like this. No, Blaze agreed. But then again, Lily wasn't supposed to disappear either. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. The study's ticking clock grew louder. Then Malin lunged for the desk drawer. Blaze stepped forward, swift and sharp, grabbing his wrist before he could reach inside. They wrestled briefly, but Blaze had leverage. He twisted the man's arm and shoved him against the wall. Mara gasped. "Stop. Not until I get answers," Blaze hissed. "All of them." He opened the drawer himself and pulled out a stack of envelopes, bound with a red ribbon. Each one bore the same initials. LRLETTER's Lilies. He turned to Mara. "You said you hadn't seen her in a year." "I didn't lie," she whispered. "Not entirely. She came to me. After the engagement broke off, she was scared. She said Everett was changing, that someone was watching her." Everett's voice echoed from the hall behind her. "Why didn't you tell me?" She turned, her expression cracked wide with guilt. "Because I thought you were involved." Blaze stepped between them. "Let's take this downstairs. You're both going to explain everything." No one moved for a moment. The tension strung high as piano wire. Then Mara nodded. "All right," she said. "But you won't like what you find, Detective. None of us will." Blaze led the way, letters in hand, questions sharper than ever. The mystery was no longer about a missing woman. It had grown roots deep into power, family, and betrayal. And the truth, whatever it was, would not come clean without a fight. Chapter 16. The Letter. Beneath the floorboards, Blaze knelt on the dusty wooden floor of Eleanor's sitting room, the air stale with disuse. He had noticed the slight unevenness earlier, the way the floorboards near the fireplace sagged just slightly under Eleanor's weight. It had gnawed at him for hours. Now, with Harold's cryptic timeline unraveling and Vincent's obsessive behavior pointing back toward this room, the moment to act had arrived. A firm tug and the loosened plank gave way with a dry creak. Beneath it, wrapped in a velvet cloth, long faded by time and dust, was a single yellowed envelope. Blaze hesitated before picking it up. Years of instinct told him this wasn't just a hidden love letter or some harmless memento. He stood, unwrapped the velvet, and turned the envelope over. There, in slanted cursive, was a name. "To be opened only by Eleanor in the event of my death." Blaze read the return address, Vincent Holloway. His jaw clenched slightly. Of course. Rosalind stepped beside him, her brow furrowed. "What is it?" "A letter. From Vincent, hidden under the floor. Meant for Eleanor. But Eleanor's alive." Blaze gave her a grim look. "Which means she never read it. Either she never knew it was here, or she chose to forget." He slit the envelope carefully. The paper crackled in protest after years of hibernation. Vincent's handwriting was a furious scrawl, as if written in a storm of panic. "My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, then something has gone wrong. I've made a mistake, one I fear cannot be undone. I uncovered something in Harold's files about your father's estate, about trust. It wasn't just mismanaged. Harold altered documents, fabricated signatures. He's laundering the money through shell companies and making it look like your inheritance is supporting charities. He threatened me, said if I interfered, I'd vanish like your uncle did. I have a copy of the file. It's in a safe place. In case I disappear, find the old ledger. You'll know where I'm sorry, Ellie, for all of it, but especially for not being braver when you needed me to be." Blaze folded the letter slowly. Rosalind was silent, reading the implications in his expression before he even spoke. "He knew," she whispered. "Vincent found out what Harold was doing. But Eleanor, she never saw this." Blaze moved toward the mantel, eyes now fixed on a chipped porcelain figurine of a knight kneeling. He turned it slightly. A faint etching lay beneath the base. "To the one who never bowed." His eyes lit up. "The ledger." "What?" Vincent was obsessive, right? Every detail mattered. If he hid the letter under the floor, he wouldn't keep the real evidence too far. "The ledger, whatever it contains, must be hidden in this house." Rosalind moved quickly to the old bookshelf on the far wall, her fingers dancing across the dusty volumes. "Some of these haven't been moved in decades." Blaze joined her, examining the spines. "Look for duplicates. A hollowed-out one. Something with a false back." It took only minutes. A thick, nondescript tome titled Financing Faith, The Rise of Post-War Charities, caught Blaze's attention. He tugged at it. It didn't budge. He pressed inward. A faint click. A hidden compartment behind the shelf slid open with a whisper. Inside was a narrow black box, locked with an old brass keyhole. Beside it sat an envelope, aged like the last one but addressed differently. "To the police, if found." Blaze took both. His mind already worried. Vincent had anticipated his own erasure. had documented everything, and Harold had nearly succeeded in burying it all. This changes everything, Rosalind breathed. Blaise nodded. And Harold knows we're close. That's why he's been spiraling. Rosalind's hand drifted to the scar on her wrist, barely healed. He won't hesitate again. He won't get the chance. Blaise looked back at the knight figurine, a symbol of defiance, of unyielding truth. We take this to Eleanor, and then we finish it. Chapter 17. The man in the photograph rain pattered softly against the windows of the cottage as Blaise sat across from Mrs. Roth again, this time holding the faded photograph in his gloved hand. The room was dimly lit by a single brass lamp, casting long shadows on the walls. Dahlia sat beside him, her notebook closed, her eyes locked onto the woman whose secrets were slowly bleeding through the seams. I don't understand, Mrs. Roth whispered, her voice trembling. That picture, it's impossible. He's been dead for over 30 years. Blaise leaned forward, his tone low but urgent. You're saying this man, this Peter Wexley, died 3 decades ago, and yet someone matching his appearance showed up to deliver the blackmail letter to your door last week. She swallowed, her lips pressed together. It can't be him. Peter died in prison. He was serving time for fraud, forgery, and a long list of sins. Dahlia raised an eyebrow. How did you know him? There was a long pause before Mrs. Roth spoke. Peter was my late husband's business partner, and my lover. Years before I met Walter Roth, Peter and I had an affair. He was reckless, charming, manipulative. He ruined lives, mine included. Blaise kept his gaze fixed. Why would someone impersonate him now? I don't know, she said, pulling her shawl closer around her. Unless someone wants me to relive that shame, to punish me for it. Dahlia glanced at Blaise. Could Peter have had any children? Someone who'd want revenge? Mrs. Roth looked down, her fingers shaking slightly. I never knew for certain, but there were rumors. He had a girl, or maybe 2. He never spoke of them. I assumed he left a trail of damage behind, but I buried that part of my past. No one knows, not even my daughter. A heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Blaise stood and paced the floor slowly. Let's say someone is impersonating Peter. They want to remind you of your sins. Why now? Why after all this time? Dahlia snapped her fingers. The auction, that's the trigger. Mrs. Roth looked up. The estate auction. What does that have to do with? Blaise's eyes narrowed. Because buried in those boxes, in those old journals and books, is something someone doesn't want the world to see, or something someone very much wants you to remember. He turned to Dahlia. The blackmailer doesn't want money. They want control. They want her to feel exposed. And maybe they want her daughter to know what she's never been told. Mrs. Roth gasped, her hand rising to her mouth. No, not Evelyn. She mustn't know. Blaise gave her a hard look. Then help us find the connection. You said Peter forged documents. What if he forged something that was hidden in your husband's archive? Mrs. Roth's eyes darted toward the old bookshelf near the fireplace. There was a ledger, a small red one. Walter kept it hidden. Said it contained details too dangerous to leave in plain sight. After his death, I never found it, but I assumed it had been thrown out. Dahlia was already moving, scanning the shelf. Is this it? She asked, pulling a dusty volume from behind a stack of gardening books. The red leather cover was cracked and brittle, but the initials WR were still embossed faintly in gold. Blaise took it gently and opened it. Inside were pages of coded transactions, signatures, names crossed out and rewritten. But one line stood out. Payment to P. Wexley, Hush Settlement, August 12, 1992. Found it, Blaise muttered. This isn't just about your past affair, Mrs. Roth. Your husband paid Peter off, possibly to keep quiet about something serious. Mrs. Roth looked pale. I never knew. Dahlia turned the page. Look at this. Same handwriting, different ink. Someone tried to scrub this out, but under the light, Blaise held it closer to the lamp, revealing a nearly erased note. Child adopted under another name. Record sealed. Not to be traced. Dahlia froze. A child. Blaise nodded slowly. A daughter, perhaps. Maybe Peter's. Maybe yours. Mrs. Roth's breath caught in her throat. No, I had a stillbirth. That's what I was told. Blaise looked at her carefully. Are you sure? I was unconscious. They told me the baby didn't survive. I never saw her. Dahlia placed a hand on the woman's shoulder. Then someone's been lying to you for decades. The air in the room turned cold. The rain intensified, and the wind howled faintly beyond the walls. Like a warning, Blaise closed the ledger, his voice low and steady. "We're no longer chasing just a blackmailer. We're chasing a ghost with a grudge, a truth buried so deep, someone's killing to keep it hidden." Mrs. Roth sat in stunned silence as Dahlia scribbled notes furiously. Blaise stepped away, his jaw tight. The mystery had deepened, the stakes had risen, and the line between past sins and present danger was beginning to vanish. Chapter 18. The final. Tracé. Silence fell over the villa as Poirot returned to the parlor, his gaze more focused than ever. The others waited, holding their breath. Madame Leclerc with her trembling shawl, Inspector Gerard clutching his notebook, Luc Marcel with eyes darting between windows as if seeking escape, and young Gastel biting her lip so hard it drew blood. Poirot stood at the fireplace and glanced at the blackened grate. "Now," he began, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve, "we bring the threads together. One by one, Mies, Amos." He turned to Madame Leclerc. "You loved your late husband, did you not?" She nodded quickly. "Of course, deeply. And yet you permitted Luc to manage his affairs in secrecy. No wife so loyal would remain ignorant, unless it was her protection she valued more." Luc shifted in his seat. "Are you accusing me again, Poirot?" "No, monsieur," said Poirot. "I accuse you of something far more subtle than murder." He walked to the center of the room. "Let me begin at the beginning. A code was discovered in the recipe indexer. Deliberate placement, yes, but not for fun. It detailed the movement of untraceable funds, through hidden accounts, spread across the continent." Gerard's brows rose. "So the cookbook was a ledger. And the cipher was known only to one person, Henry Leclerc, until someone else deciphered it. Someone who realized the implications and wished to protect their name from scandal." Estelle's voice cracked. "It wasn't me. I never even opened that book." "I believe you," said Poirot gently. "But someone else opened it after Henry's death, panicked, and acted hastily." He faced Madame Leclerc. "Your maid, Sandrine, was blackmailing someone, not your son, not Estelle, but you," the old woman gasped, her hand flying to her heart. "You tried to buy her silence, did you not? And when that failed, you dismissed her. But she had already made a copy of the index, which she gave to someone else for safekeeping, perhaps to use as leverage." Luc paled. "To whom?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "To the only person clever enough to manipulate all of you, Chef Roland." Dead silence. "Chef Roland," Gerard whispered. Yes, he knew the code. He had studied Henry's writing style, but he did not anticipate one thing, that Sandrine would be found dead. "But she died of a fall," Luc argued. Poirot shook his head. "She was pushed. It was not a fall, but a gentle shove at the top of the cellar stairs. A small bruise on the back of the head, overlooked." Roland feared she had confided too much. Madame Leclerc choked back a sob. Why would he kill Henry?" "He didn't," Poirot said. "Henry's death was natural, but the threat came afterward, the possibility that the funds could be traced to his family. To you," his voice lowered, "and you, Madame Leclerc, in fear of your name being dragged into scandal. You burned the original ledger, but Roland already had a copy." She wept quietly. Estelle whispered, "But the second murder, the man on the train?" Poirot nodded gravely. "That was not a murder at all. It was Roland himself, fleeing under disguise. He had staged the attack, planted false evidence, and switched identities with a contact before the police could identify him. A trick most devious." Gerard rubbed his temples. "And where is he now?" Poirot reached into his coat and held up a train schedule. "On a ferry bound for Corsica. I wired the Coast Guard 2 hours ago." He turned slowly to Madame Leclerc. "I do not think you meant for anyone to die, but by hiding what you knew, you endangered many. You were protecting the reputation of a man already dead." She nodded faintly, crushed. Gerard stood, composing himself. "I'll take it from here. Charges may still be pressed for obstruction." Madame Poirot adjusted his tie and moved toward the door. As for the recipe book, it was not a cookbook. It was a confession in disguise. Estelle ran after him. "Monsieur Poirot, what do we do now?" He smiled kindly. "Live truthfully, mademoiselle. That is all any of us can do." And with that, Hercule Poirot, the little man with the great moustache, stepped out into the cold morning mist, leaving behind a home forever changed by a secret hidden, not in spices or sauces, but between the lines of a recipe never meant to be cooked.